Running radio programs of its type. It's been on the air since 1967 and brought to you by Apex Bank of Camden. 3 locations in Camden, Big Sandy and Brewston. Today's program after this.
Hello everyone, this is Marcus Vine and Sean Hattler with Apex Bank of Camden, and we're getting ready for our 14th annual Easter egg hunt.
That's right, and it's West Tennessee's largest Easter egg hunt on Saturday, April 16th, 11 a.m. at Briarwood School Field. There will be over 10,000 eggs, lots of prizes, and the Easter Bunny will be there.
So don't miss it, folks. Bring the children ages 2 to 8, and we will see you on Saturday, April 16th at 11 a.m. at Briarwood Field. Happy Easter, everyone, from Apex Bank.
Apex Bank, building stronger communities together. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
Good Saturday morning to you, everybody. Welcome to Operation 7570 for this first Saturday of April 2022. Can you believe it? We're already 3 months into 2022, and now April has arrived, the second day of April, and it's great to have you with us today, whether you're joining us on radio, WRJB, WRJBradio.com, or have joined us by way of Facebook Live today. Great to have you with us. In our studios live with us this morning, our guest of honor today, this is Kevin Brewer. He's on the faculty at Big Sandy School. We appreciate Kevin getting up so early. Going to have a good discussion about history, particularly the presidential history, and we're going way back even before some of the modern era presidents that we're all are accustomed to. But Kevin, thank you, sir. Thank you for getting up so early. I appreciate it, my friend.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the invitation. It's an honor to be here.
Have you had a good week, spring break? Have you had a good spring break week?
Had spring break. I guess I'll do what we all do, which is come in complaining about the weather. Had a pretty day on Tuesday, and it's been something of a washout otherwise. But I was grateful for the rest.
Well, we talk about the fact we've just introduced you as a member of the faculty at Big Sandy School. We appreciate that, native of Benton County. But give us a little more history about Kevin Brewer. Who is Kevin Brewer, and how did you develop such an interest in history and wanting to go into education?
Well, I grew up in Benton County, of course, on the highway between Camden and Big Sandy, and went to Big Sandy School. And the interest in American history is to some degree a mystery as far as the very beginning of it. My older brother Tim, who you knew, had, as a young boy, had sort of a passing interest in this, and he brought some books and things home from school, and I latched on to those, and it became a lifelong obsession. And then when I started school, Mrs. Ona Jones, who that's a name that a lot of people in Benton County will know, was my third grade teacher, and she was a person who was very influential on me when I was a young kid, and helped instill in me this love of American history. She lent me books and talked to me about it, and it just became a part of me.
Okay. And as you went older, the passion continued in your life, of course, and went on to a college. Tell me about your college careers and the degrees you hold, and how you ended up, with the job down at Big Sandy.
Well, first I have to say that I was in high school, of course. I was very heavily influenced by Diane Paget, another name that everyone around here knows, and she fostered this love of history that I had. When I ended up in college at UT Knoxville, which is where I got my first degree, I got a political science degree, and was planning to become a lawyer, and then changed my mind about that later on and went back to UT for grad school in education, got teaching credentials, and the Big Sandy School, it's actually Mrs. Paget again, actually contacted me and had an opening and wanted to know if I was interested in coming and taking it. My brother Tim, as you know, was very sick by then with ALS, which was yet another reason for me to come back to the area. And so I came back here and took the job at Big Sandy in 1995 and have been there ever since.
As we talk about history, of course, American history, your passion for it, but you have particular interest, you have a very strong passion for presidential history. How did all that come about?
I do. Again, there were a couple of books that Tim brought home when he was a kid before I even started school. And I started thumbing through those. I also remember, and I have a friend who I have discussed this with before, that the World Book Encyclopedias, thumbing through the World Book Encyclopedias growing up, and those things had such a big effect on people, and reading about the presidents and the presidency. I think there's something in the linearity of the presidency as it unfolds through American history since 1789, when it began, that allows you to almost clock American history since 1789 by thinking about who the president was. If you can nail down the identity of the president, then you will know what the issues of the day were. It's a flawless timeline that goes all the way back into the 18th century.
That was a talking point I had. You've touched on it this morning, but how did the United States come about by having a chief, by the head of state? How did it come about for us to have a president as opposed to a king or a prime minister or those types of leaders?
Well, of course, by the time the revolution ended, the fighting in the Revolutionary War ended in 1781, and the treaty that concluded that was concluded in 1783. And of course, by that time, Americans had had enough of kings and prime ministers and even parliaments, but there really was no viable alternative. They thrashed around for a few years under the Articles of Confederation with no executive at all before the Constitution was written, and clearly that wasn't going to work. You will always run across references to the idea that George Washington probably could have been king of the United States had he so chosen. But Washington didn't want there to be a king in the United States. And he served, of course, as the president of the Constitutional Convention that met in Philadelphia in 1787. And one of the things that we know from reading the notes of the people who participated in the creation of the Constitution is that Washington, sitting up at the front of the room, not sure whether he knew it or not, he probably knew, the presidency was built around him. These men were discussing, voting on what kind of person could serve as the chief executive of a country like this, and the whole time they're asking themselves that question, the answer appears in front of them in the form of George Washington, who's sitting up at the head of the room. So the presidency really was constructed around the person of George Washington.
Yeah. And the swearing in of George Washington, it really, I mean, when he took his oath of office back in those days, he really wasn't sworn in Washington, D.C. at the time, was he?
No, there was no Washington, D.C. at the time. The area that is now Washington, D.C. was really not much more than a swamp. Tiber Creek ran through that area. It was low-lying. It was very swampy. It was very often disease-ridden. Washington, D.C. didn't exist. The initial capital of the United States was New York City, which is where Washington was sworn in the first time. And then subsequently the capital was moved to Philadelphia. The Constitution had provided that a capital could be established that would not be a part of any state, and that states could give up land on which the capital could be constructed. And Virginia and Maryland had land that they were willing to give up that was quite near Washington's home. Washington wanted the capital on the Potomac. At the Potomac, the capital, at the time, the Potomac was the midpoint between North and South, more or less, and it was near Washington's home. He wanted the capital there, and it was considered part of the South pretty much. Culturally, it was very Southern. And a deal was struck between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton in which the South got the capital. The capital was put on the Potomac, and they started the construction of the buildings. Washington wanted the buildings constructed because he thought that if he could get the buildings built, then no one would be able to back down. He didn't want to lose the capital to New York, which by then was emerging as sort of the cultural capital of the country. He wanted the government capital to be different.
Now, as we go back to that early history, Washington is the first president, as we all know. At that time, did the founding fathers, did they also, choose for Washington to have a vice president and a cabinet as we know today? Or how did those appointments or those positions come about?
Well, the cabinet is mentioned sort of obliquely in the Constitution, in which it says that the president can consult with the heads of the executive departments. Other than that, the Constitution says very little about the cabinet itself, and that is something that mostly evolved. The vice presidential story, that's a quite complicated story. There were no parties in America in the very early days of the Republic during Washington's first term, and Washington didn't want any parties, and they had the Electoral College was set up genuinely with the idea that the states, through some means, popular vote or otherwise, would choose electors, and those electors would choose the best person in the country to be president. And then the person, this was in the original text of the Constitution, the person who received the second highest number of electoral votes would become vice president. That's how Washington became president and John Adams became vice president twice. The problem with that was that by 1796, when Washington was ready to retire after 2 terms, parties had developed. So now instead of just having electors chosen and choosing the best person for the office and the runner-up becoming vice president, now you had a situation in which you had people actually vying for office in the form of parties and what we call the first party system, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. That meant that in 1796, when John Adams eked out a victory over Thomas Jefferson, Jefferson became vice president. So you can imagine a situation in which your opponent becomes vice. Imagine that situation today in which the person who lost the presidential election becomes the vice president. And then, so that was considered sort of a misfire in the system. And then in 1800, it for sure misfired when the vice presidential candidate, which there was really no such thing as running for vice president. Everyone had to run for president. But the person who was considered to be the vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr, became ambitious and tried to become president. So after that election, the 12th Amendment to the Constitution was proposed and ratified rather quickly to separate the election of the presidency and the vice presidency. Became 2 different sets of electoral votes so that wouldn't happen again.
The Electoral College, we've probably heard more about the Electoral College in the last couple of election cycles than ever before in our history, but explain what the Electoral College is all about and what role that plays in the overall selection of a president of the United States.
Well, that's another complicated topic, and it's a hard one to discuss because it gets very politically charged. The Electoral College, as it was originally conceived, was that the states, each state, through some mechanism, and it did not have to be popular vote, and in fact it was not popular vote in many of them for many years. There was no presidential election in South Carolina involving voters until the time of the Civil War. The state legislature simply chose the electors, which is still an option today. The Constitution states that the state legislature can choose the electors any way it wishes. And the states are allocated electors based on a formula which is the number of House members that you have, which is based on population, plus 2, the 2 senators. So the combined number, that's the number of electors you have. Tennessee has 9 House members today, so it has 11 electoral votes and has had for many years. And then those people on a date, then those people are chosen. Today, all of the states use popular vote to decide which group of electors get chosen. And then those are the people who meet in the state capitals in December following the election, and they cast the official votes for president and vice president. In a normal year, of course, in a normal election, we already know who those people are, so we already know how they're going to vote. So if if a Republican slate of electors is chosen in Tennessee, those 11 Republicans will meet in Nashville in December after the election, and they will each cast one vote for president and one vote for vice president. And you have to receive a majority of all the electors. That's a tricky thing because people have different ideas in their heads about what a majority is. But when the Constitution says majority of the electors, it means an actual majority, which is more than half, not just more than anyone else got, but more than half of all the electors. There are 538 electors. A majority of 538 is 270. That's the reason on election night when we're watching the presidential election, that magic number is 270. If you get to 270, then you have a majority of all the electoral votes and you are chosen as president.
There have been a couple of instances in United States presidential history. There have been a couple of instances where the candidate that got the most votes, the most popular votes out there, did not receive the number of electoral votes to become president.
Yes, and it's it's happened a couple of times in recent history. That used to be something that we talked about. That happened long ago, and there was a lot of speculation. What if this actually happened in the modern world? And then in 2000, it happened again for the first time in a great many years. You had instances in which the House of Representatives had to choose the president, which is the backup election procedure in the Constitution. If no one receives a majority of the electoral votes, like if you had three candidates who were all receiving electoral votes instead of two, then the House of Representatives ends up choosing from the top three candidates. Thomas Jefferson was elected that way the first time. I think that's not widely known. The House of Representatives chose Thomas Jefferson. No one had a majority of the electoral vote. John Quincy Adams was chosen that way in an extremely contentious election in 1824, which is an example of what you're talking about. Andrew Jackson had more, by considerable margin, more popular votes, the votes of the people, than any of the other candidates. But he did not have a majority of the electoral votes. And when the vote went to the House of Representatives, John Quincy Adams was chosen. Grover Cleveland was president from 1885, and then in 1888, he ran for re-election against Benjamin Harrison, and Cleveland actually received more popular votes than Harrison did, but Harrison won the election without the involvement of the House of Representatives in that one. And so that is definitely a possibility.
The presidential terms today, a president can serve two consecutive four-year terms. Then after that second four-year term, 8 years he has to leave office. But has that always been the case? Have we always had four-year terms for presidents?
The term has always been 4 years, but there was no limit on the number of times that a president could be elected. George Washington, who had given huge chunks of his life to public service, always since young adulthood, served the first presidential term, obviously. He considered retiring in 1792 and was talked out of it by James Madison because Madison convinced him that the presidency itself might not survive, that the country was not ready for anyone other than Washington to be president. Washington was somewhat exasperated by this, but he decided to stand for another term, as they called it in those days. Of course, he did not campaign for president. He simply waited for the votes to come. So he served a second term, and he put his foot down in 1796 and said that he would not serve another term as president. So that set a precedent that a lot of people felt over the years that they could not break. Thomas Jefferson was the next person who had an opportunity to serve a third term, and he wanted a third term, but he seemed to indicate that he could not do that because General Washington didn't do it, and I'm not going to do something that General Washington refused to do. And that became sort of the pattern. I think probably the next president who seriously considered a third term was Ulysses S. Grant. There were plenty of people who wanted to run Grant again at a later time. And then no one actually did it until Franklin Roosevelt decided to run in 1940. Of course, by then, the world was at war. We were not yet in the war, but the war was underway, and Roosevelt decided to run again and did. And then, of course, after that, actually was elected to a fourth term. But it does not have to be consecutive. Grover Cleveland served 4 years and then was out 4 years and then came back. But in the 50s, after FDR, when the Republicans gained control of Congress, they proposed the 22nd Amendment to the Constitution, which limits any particular person to 2 terms as president, plus possibly 2 years of someone else's term. So if you are the Vice President of the United States and you become president, the determinant is how far into that term were you when you became president. That's what determines whether you can be elected once or twice. Lyndon Johnson, for instance, served a little over a year of John F. Kennedy's term as president, and then was elected in 64 and was running in 68 before he decided to drop out, because he was eligible for 2 more terms because he had served less than 2 years of Kennedy's term. If you served more than 2 years of the other term, then you were only eligible to be elected once.
Now, when you get up to talk about President Johnson and after him President Nixon, of course, and bringing it forward from that point, this is really what I consider the present day, although they go back 50, 60 plus years, of course. But beyond what I call, Kevin, the present day, who are some presidents that you are really fascinated with in your studies?
Well, of course, there's so much fascination out there about Abraham Lincoln. He's one of the most biographized people in world history. In fact, I think I have seen various accounts that only 1 or 2 people in world history are more biographized than Abraham Lincoln. There's so much material out there, and he's such an interesting character. But I've long been drawn to the lesser-known presidents. There's something about the idea of these men moving almost anonymously through the pages of history and receiving almost no mention at all, that it has always caused me to want to know more about them. I think that group of presidents just before the Civil War, who blundered so badly, those men in various ways, and helped bring on the war. Millard Fillmore to a lesser degree, Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan to a strong degree are very interesting characters. I have long been interested in Warren G. Harding from the 1920s, who has come down to us as, supposedly this great failure of a president. And, when I was a kid, he was often listed as the worst president in American history. And if you dig into Harding's history, there were scandals there, but they really weren't. I'm not going to say they weren't his fault. He was responsible for his administration, but he himself was not particularly corrupt, and he did a lot of good things. And I've been very interested in Harding, and in fact, I've traveled to Ohio on a few occasions to participate in some Harding events up there to learn more about him. And there is an effort underway to rehabilitate Warren Harding. But some of the more obscure presidents, I think, need to be looked at. In fact, I read a book just recently called The Forgotten Presidents. One in particular is, maybe the least known president of all, Chester A. Arthur, who served 3.5 years of the assassinated President James A. Garfield's term in the early 1880s. Arthur is a fascinating individual because he was what you might call a hack. He was a political hack, a political hatchet man in New York. He was considered a product of the spoils system. As I said about Harding, Arthur was not himself corrupt, but he had made himself rich and powerful through various kinds of intrigue and through his position as the collector of the Port of New York. and was always moving in the shadows behind other powerful people like Roscoe Conkling. And then suddenly, just to satisfy a particular branch of the Republican Party, Arthur finds himself vice president. And, someone said, good God, I cannot imagine Chester A. Arthur as president. Thank God President Garfield is relatively young and healthy and so forth. And then Garfield was assassinated, and Arthur became president. And people were openly horrified at the prospect of Arthur as president of the United States. Arthur pulled himself together, cut off, for the most part, his old buddies who thought that now they were going to have a party with him as president, told them that he was now the president of the United States and circumstances had changed. And Arthur, for 3.5 years, did a fine job running the United States executive branch, such that no less a person than Mark Twain himself commented at the time that Arthur left office. He said, I don't know how anyone could have done a better job. And people were simply stunned at how well he did. He's an example of a person who rose to the occasion. And I think that's something that we now sometimes are lacking. We used to have this idea that people grew into the office of the presidency. David McCullough, the historian, once commented that almost everyone who was ever in the presidency left the office a better man than he was when he went in it. Chester Arthur is definitely an example of that.
Well, I tell you, time is really getting away. Interesting discussion today, and what we need to do right now is take a break for our sponsor, Apex Bank. We'll be back with the second portion of Operation 7570.
Hello, everyone. This is Marcus Vine and Sean Hattler with Apex Bank of Camden, and we're getting ready for our 14th annual Easter egg hunt.
That's right, and it's West Tennessee's largest Easter egg hunt on Saturday, April 16th, 11 a.m. at Briarwood School Field. There will be over 10,000 eggs, lots of prizes, and the Easter Bunny will be there.
So don't miss it, folks. Bring the children ages 2 to 8, and we will see you on Saturday, April 16th at 11 a.m. at Briarwood Field. Happy Easter, everyone, from Apex Bank.
Apex Bank, building stronger communities together. Member FDIC, Equal Housing Lender.
We're back on the second portion of Operation 7570 this morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you again for being with us. Kevin Brewer, a history teacher at Big Sandy School, is our guest this morning, talking about aspects of history, specifically presidential history, but Kevin likes all sorts of history, as we discussed on the first portion of the program. But Kevin, in our discussions of just any type of history, do you remember what the first major historical event, do you remember what that event was, whether you saw it on television or experienced it?
Well, I'll start by talking about something I don't remember, which is much to my frustration, which is the Apollo 11 moon landing. And what frustrates me about that is that it should have been the single biggest thing, of course, that everyone around me was talking about. I was 4 years old, and I can remember things earlier than that, and I cannot remember it at all. I have the vaguest memories of President Johnson, who left office in 1969, just before I turned 4. So I have very vague notions of knowing that he was president of the United States. The first big political event that I clearly remember is the 1972 presidential election in which President Nixon was reelected, running against George McGovern. And the reason I remember that is, and this may go back to your question about how I became interested in this kind of thing, my brother Tim had a book that he had brought home from one of those. You remember ordering books at school?
Yes, absolutely.
He had one of those called the Arrow Book of Presidents that ended with President Nixon. And on the last couple of pages of that, there were pages with lines and brackets and so forth to put the candidates for the 72 election. And I remember that Tim was doing that. He was I still have that book somewhere with his writing in it, was filling in information in the back of that book about the 72 election. And I remember that.
Well, the one that comes to my mind is November 22, 1963, the assassination of President John Kennedy. And it was my mother's birthday, as a matter of fact, so that vividly stands out in my mind. And I think, that's really when we started knowing what television was all about. Of course,
Right.
we had televisions, but hey, that was the event that changed television.
Yeah, and you were not alone. That is an event that is burned into the minds of a lot of people older than me. That was about a year and a half before I was born.
We talk about presidential history, of course, and, some of the presidents, and during the time that the president is living, the people, the generation, they may not think too much of the president. You done mention some of those cases, but as history goes along, 40, 50 years down the road, historians look back at the presidential history of a certain individual. Do they sometimes cast, a better light as to what this individual was all about and what he was trying to do?
Yes, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, you have to realize that, and sometimes it can happen very quickly. Abraham Lincoln was hated and despised by very large numbers of people all over the country, not only in the South, but large numbers of people in the North who did not like the way Lincoln handled the war. And Lincoln, of course, dying the way he did and dying when he did, was set up for this sort of martyrdom. But as far as the idea of historical distance, you take someone like Herbert Hoover, who, of course, was reviled during the Great Depression because people were suffering, and they wanted to blame it on someone, and so they blamed it on President Hoover. A lot of people still look back sort of negatively on Hoover, but those who really study government have a longer view of Hoover. And Hoover lived a very long life after his presidency. He didn't die. He outlived Kennedy. Speaking of Kennedy, Hoover didn't die until the following year after Kennedy did, so he lived a long time. And by then, he was sort of rehabilitated. Even President Truman, who was of the other party, reached out to Hoover and gave him important responsibilities after World War II and helped Hoover rehabilitate his image. But history and the consideration of leaders is an ongoing thing. It's not a fixed thing, as you observe. And I mentioned Harding. There's a pretty big movement underway now to reconsider Harding. Certainly not as a great president. He only served about 2.5 years, but as someone who has become sort of a punchline in history and who deserves better. There are some important scholars who are working on the Harding papers and reconsidering Harding. And so, yes, the image of presidents can change over time.
And it's interesting as well when you go back to the publications, the newspapers of those days, political cartoonists, political cartoons. I've seen some of those from those eras then, and some of those political cartoonists back in the day, they could be a little nasty.
They were absolutely nasty. The 20th and the 21st centuries did not invent the nasty political cartoon that goes back many, many years. If you go back and look at some of the political cartoons, even from the 18th century, in the days of Washington and Adams, they were brutal. And the political cartoons around the time of Andrew Jackson's day, in that 1824 election in which John Quincy Adams was chosen president by the House of Representatives, and the attacks on Adams, the attacks on Henry Clay, the attacks on Jackson himself. Jackson was routinely portrayed in the Whig press, and the Whig Party was a party that was created specifically to oppose Andrew Jackson. The cartoons portrayed Jackson as an old, decrepit, evil-looking king sitting on a big throne, and the throne sometimes is made of bones or something to suggest his brutal actions as a military leader, and invariably he will have his foot resting on the U.S. Constitution, and is holding a scepter and is portrayed definitely as a tyrant. These political cartoons were brutal, and that is not a new phenomenon.
I want to get in here in just a minute, talk about some of the trips you've had the fortune to be on in recent years in your journeys. But before we do that, I've got to ask you this. Has there ever been a president from Tennessee?
there have been three presidents who were from Tennessee in that they made their homes in Tennessee. No president has ever been born in Tennessee. Andrew Jackson, who of course is maybe the most famous Tennessean ever, Jackson was born in South Carolina, but made his home in Nashville, and you've probably been to the Hermitage. I've been to the Hermitage, was there recently, in fact. James K. Polk was born in North Carolina and made his home in Tennessee, lived in Nashville. And just a few months ago, I visited a home that Polk lived in Columbia as a younger man. He did not really live there in his adulthood, at least not very much. And Andrew Johnson, the third Tennessee president, but he was not born here either. He was born in North Carolina, like Polk, and ended up making his home in Tennessee.
Yeah. Well, of course, Al Gore tried to get the presidency 20-plus years ago. Most of us are familiar with that, of course. But beyond Senator Gore at the time or Vice President Gore at the time, have there been other Tennesseans who have sought this high office?
Tennesseans who I don't think Cordell Hull never tried to become president. Tennesseans who ran for president and lost. I can't think of any.
Well, Estes Kefauver in the
Kefauver.
I remember him back in the 50s, and I can't remember if he ever tried the presidency, but I want to say for somehow, if he was an enemy at first, or I say a political foe, that's a better term, but he and Adlai Stevenson may have lined up together. I can't remember.
Maybe so. I remember his name from the Kefauver committee in Congress, and he was quite a powerful figure. I don't remember if he was. He was never the candidate for president.
Okay.
He was never the losing candidate for president.
Yeah, I'll have to go back and research that then. But Senator Estes Kefauver goes back to the 50s, maybe the early 60s then. And we're getting into a lot of Tennessee history right now. But as I mentioned just a minute ago, Kevin, you've had the opportunity to do some traveling and learn more. Tell me about some of your educational trips that you've taken and how they have helped you.
Well, when I started teaching, I didn't know that teaching, if you dig for the opportunities, presents opportunities for all kinds of travel. You just have to dig in and find it. The first time this happened to me, someone brought to my attention something called Presidential Classroom in Washington, which was something that was established under a different name at first during the Kennedy administration, where people who teach school throughout the country could come up to Washington and participate in this program where students from around the country came into D.C. and participated in these sort of debate forums. And they needed teachers to come in to facilitate the debates. And I sent in an application and was accepted and was invited up and went up to Washington in 1999, working with a bunch of kids I'd never laid eyes on, many of them from Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico tends to have a lot of kids who are interested in this presidential classroom program. And that was a fascinating experience, and that was what sort of whetted my appetite for that. But it was not paid. I had to do that on my own money. And then I found out about the James Madison Foundation, local. Somebody that a lot of people around here would know, Mike Bell, who used to be the principal at Big Sandy School, told me about the James Madison Foundation. And I started looking into that and discovered that the James Madison Foundation does a $24,000 fellowship award, one per state per year. And if you get that, what you have to do is get a master's degree in history or government at a four-year institution somewhere, and then continue teaching. Well, I already had a master's degree in education, but I kept thinking, I sure would like to do that. It would be so terribly interesting, and it was so competitive. And so I spent, I think the first year was probably 2001, I started filling out the application, and I got busy with other things, and I just pushed it aside and didn't finish it. And the following year, in 2002, I started over on it, and I said, I'm going to send this thing in and see what happens. I'll probably never hear from them again. I sent it in, and then one day in March 2003, my wife called me at work and said, you've got something here from the James Madison Foundation. And I said, well, what is it? And she said, it's a package. And I said, an envelope or a package? And she said, it's a package, a big package. And she opened it up, and I had been selected as Tennessee's one and only James Madison Fellow for the 2003 class. And I was overjoyed by this and very proud. And then when I got home, after all of the elation died down, I said, I've got to go back to school. If I accept this, I have to go back to school. So I went and enrolled one class at a time at Murray State. One class at a time. It took 5 years because I was only going at night one time a week, and got a second master's degree, this time in history, from Murray State. But the greatest part of that experience was I got to go, if you are a Madison Fellow, you have to go to Georgetown University in Washington and live for a month, and take their Constitution courses up there from really leading scholars. And that was some experience. That was all paid. We lived in the dorms. We lived on the Georgetown campus for a month. I had a brand new baby at home, but my wife was very accommodating of this, and I was gone for a month, and that was some experience. And then you teach. You promise that you'll continue to teach for 2 years after they pay for your master's degree. I, of course, have taught a great many years beyond that and have more than satisfied that requirement. And then after that, I found out about the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has a cluster of one-week seminars for teachers around the country every year. It's a different, some of them repeat, but I mean, they are everywhere, and they're very specific. It's called Landmarks of American History and Culture, usually centered on the importance of some place in history and what happened there. And I've applied for those, and I have been to 6 of them. I haven't done it in several years. COVID shut it down for a couple of years. But after you invited me to be on the show here today, I found out that I had been accepted to go to Gettysburg in July of this year.
Well,
So
congratulations.
I told you when I was talking to you that I had applied. I didn't know if I would be accepted or not, and I was. So in July, I'll be going up to Gettysburg. We'll be staying at Gettysburg College for a week, studying with prominent Civil War historians, studying the battlefield, studying different sort of cultural ideas that come out of the Gettysburg experience, sort of, what did Gettysburg mean at the time? What did it mean later? Studying Lincoln's activities there. And that's going to be a really good one. I've been on some great trips. This is one that I'm really looking forward to.
That's going to be a great experience. Now, how many similar personnel, how many similar people to Kevin Brewer will be on this type of program?
There will be, I think, 40, or it may be 36. I think they've cut it down to 36. It used to be 40. None of them will be people that I know unless just by chance, although I've been to enough of these that I have occasionally crossed paths with someone I met at a different one. I went to one of these in Montana, where I went to Montana in 2013 to study the history of hard rock copper mining in Montana. That was absolutely, so far, that was my favorite trip. It was the one I was the most skeptical of, and I had a terrific time in Montana and learned a lot. That was a fascinating experience out there. But when I got there, I ran into another teacher that I had met in 2012 in New York City. When I was in New York, we were staying right in the middle of Manhattan, right off of Riverside Drive. I could walk out the back door of the hotel and be standing at Grant's tomb in Riverside Park. I was there for a week in 2012 and met this guy, and then ran into him again in Montana, which was a small world kind of an experience. But I do occasionally cross paths with someone I know.
A lot of opportunities that you've shared with us today, Kevin. A lot of opportunities for a young man from Big Sandy, Tennessee.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was when I began to learn about these trips, I thought, boy, this is really something that a lot of people don't know. So if you're out there and you're teaching and you're interested in history, this is out there. Get in touch with me. Dig around on the internet. There are free trips out there. You can get away for a week. It'll cost you nothing, and it's tremendous fun. And there are, I'm sure, similar opportunities for teachers who teach other things. In fact, sometimes teachers who teach other things pop up in these. For instance, there's in Massachusetts, there's a National Endowment for the Humanities history seminar on Emily Dickinson. The history of Emily Dickinson's life and the writing of her poetry, but certainly there are opportunities there for English teachers who want to go, and you don't have to be a history teacher to go.
Yeah, and the disciplines, they cross over, whether you're history, science, English, literature, all these disciplines, they cross over and have similar things, don't they?
Absolutely. The NEH has a program at Cape Canaveral on the space program. The problem with some of these trips, the ones in California, is that I say they pay everything. That's not exactly accurate. There is a stipend. The stipend is $1,300. And sometimes the housing, if there is a dormitory involved, the housing is cheap, like at Gettysburg. But if there's not a dormitory involved, like at Cape Canaveral, it's hotels. And even if they negotiate down the price of the hotels, you're going to blow through a $1,300 stipend pretty quickly staying for a week at Cape Canaveral. So you could end up spending some of your own money.
Your students at Big Sandy School that are going through high school right now and into the future, whatever past career that they choose then, do they have an interest? Do they want to learn from you and plan for the future? Or have kids changed since you've been teaching in recent years?
I generally find that the students, when I begin to encounter them, which is as ninth graders, they are pretty skeptical of history and don't much care for it. I consider it a prime goal of mine to change their minds about that. I think I've had a lot of success at that. I haven't had the kind of, certainly have not had 100% success at that. You can't change someone's interest that easily, and you can't change everyone's interest. But I do think that I have generally sent my students home with a greater appreciation of the struggles that the people in the past went through, and trying to get them to understand that these were just men and women working in a fog like we all do, trying to get through what was their present, and that we look back on them and say, well, they should have done this, they should have done that, why didn't they do this? You weren't there. They were there. They were the ones who were actually there having to try to solve the problem. And I think I've also done, one of my strengths is to convey to them sort of the drama of history and the fact that there really is a story here that's meaningful if you look for it. And I've gotten a lot of positive feedback over the years. That I suspect I've got some former students right now who are listening to this. I certainly hope so.
Well,
I love my former students.
Absolutely, and a big shout out to all your former students down at Big Sandy School. And I would think, when I do research, it's kind of interesting. You're doing research, and I'm sure you found this, Kevin. You're going in looking for a certain thing on a certain issue, but you find all these things, these little unknown things, these little things that just pop up that you had no clue about, these little sidebars, you might say, that pops up.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I've recently read Garrett Graff's book Watergate: A New History, which is a very long, detailed account of the Watergate scandal. And of course, I lived through that as a young kid. I didn't know that George Steinbrenner was involved in Watergate. George Steinbrenner of the New York Yankees was actually indicted. Not for direct involvement in what we call Watergate, but as part of the greater Watergate set of scandals. George Steinbrenner's shipping company, Steinbrenner was paying fake bonuses to his regular employees and then having them kick that money back into the Nixon re-election campaign. And so, here's $25,000 bonus for you. You are to pay $24,000 of this into the Nixon re-election campaign. I had no idea that George Steinbrenner was involved in the Nixon scandals.
Well, that's news to me as well.
Well, that's something that I have just learned.
Glad he went to baseball.
He was pardoned by President Reagan. He actually had a felony conviction.
Wow.
And was pardoned by President Reagan.
Yeah. Before we close, I want to say a shout out to your son down at the University of Tennessee at Martin. He has a nice exhibit on display, and you were down there this week, a few days ago. Tell me about that and what this young man's going to do in the future.
Yes, my son Knox is getting ready to graduate from the University of Tennessee at Martin with a degree in art, and he has an exhibit of images that he has recreated in perler beads, these little beads that kids used to play with, but he's made these giant images from photographs and mostly from movie posters, in which he has explored the way the colors interact and so forth. And if you get up close to them, you see, well, these are perler beads, but if you back off, it becomes an image. And I don't know what I don't know what the future holds for him, but Knox is a fine young man and very talented.
And that display is down there, which building? And people, he's not going to be there, we know that, but if people are down on campus for any reason, they'd be welcome to go by and see the display.
It's in the Fine Arts building on the UT Martin campus, and we'll be there, I think, until the 9th.
Okay, well, very good, and congratulations to him, and best of luck to him on down the road. Kevin, we're all out of time, and I didn't get to half of our talking points today, but we'll have you back on down the road. Thank you for what you're doing. We appreciate you so very much, and thank you for being a fine educator in our Benton County school system, particularly down at Big Sandy, and give the family my best, my friend. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Flash. It was a real honor to be here. Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
Always great to see you. Kevin Brewer, our guest this morning, ladies and gentlemen, on Operation 7570. That's our program. We've been brought your way today by our good friends at Apex Bank. Join us again next Saturday morning. Stay tuned next for Luke Crutchfield with The Bargain Auction.
Hello, everyone. This is Marcus Vine and Sean Hattler with Apex Bank of Camden, and we're getting ready for our 14th annual Easter egg hunt.
That's right, and it's West Tennessee's largest Easter egg hunt on Saturday, April